with this honest to goodness happy smile on his face. Pop, I've got a better idea. And so the scene shifts to the gates of heaven, and we see the Spectre standing with Pop in front of the Archangel Michael. And Michael says, Spectre, do you not recall? I've said that Jim Corrigan is welcome to walk through gates of heaven, but you are not. Why are you here? The Spectre says, I'm not here for me. I am here for this man. He should be allowed entry into heaven. And Michael looks at Pop and looks back at the Spectre and says, no, there is no place for this man in heaven. He can be reincarnated and have another chance to enter the light at the end of his next life. And this concerns the Spectre. And he says to Michael, but this man has committed no sin. And Michael says, Spectre, you must understand that while this man has not committed any significant sin, he has also not done anything which makes him worthy of entering the light. So few are worthy of entering through the gates of heaven. And so it appears that Pop is just going to have to go back to the cemetery or accept reincarnation. But then the gates open a crack, and Michael notices this and turns to Spectre and smiles and says, well, evidently, Spectre, you have a friend here in heaven. And Spectre has a surprised look on his face, and he says, Amy? And we see the shadowy figure of Amy Baderman welcoming Pop into heaven. And as Poplansky walks into the light, he smiles at the Spectre and says, and now you have two friends in heaven. Really sweet story. I know I've spoiled the heck of this story, but it's well worth the read. So nice to see a character who is often frowned upon and treated with a fair amount of scorn and derision by fans and historians alike, being painted in a much better light here in this run, and being integrated into this whole post-crisis timeline for a Spectre that Ostrander-Mandrake have been creating. And yes, Pop will make a return during the Desecration storyline, which I'll be talking about later in this episode or in part 5. Now, as for the next Golden Age character to make her return, well, I guess I kind of gave it away by mentioning the character's gender. It's Clarice Winston. And it's a very interesting way in which Corrigan is reunited with his lost love. Scene opens at a hospital where we see an elderly woman bandaged up almost entirely on life support, and evidently she is the victim of an attempted murder. And we see Nate questioning the woman's son, Douglas Marchbanks, and Douglas has a lot of anger towards his mother. He doesn't feel bad at all that she's suffering the way she is, but he states unequivocally that he is not the one who tried to murder her. And given that Clarice is quite wealthy and she's been something of a celebrity over the years, Nate is warned to simmer down in terms of his interrogation. Because they're dealing with a celebrity case here, they've got to be a little careful. Well, Corrigan enters the hospital room and looks at Clarice, and he's introduced to Clarice's granddaughter, Clarissa, who appears to love her grandmother very much. But Clarissa excuses herself for a period, and that leaves Corrigan alone with Clarice. And here, Clarice explains what happened to her in the ensuing years after Jim Corrigan broke off their engagement. We see that Corrigan actually drove Clarice back to her home, went into the home with her, and broke up with her there. And it was still just as painful a breakup as depicted in More Fun Comics, number 53. Right. Clarice explains that at first she thought that Corrigan was leaving her for another woman because she later saw a picture of him with another young lady, but turns out that wasn't the case. But Clarice explains that she fell into a deep depression after Jim left her, and she actually attempted suicide at different points and discovered that she could not die. And that got her to thinking that there was some connection that Corrigan established with her. But still, Clarice tried to continue on with her life. She was a wealthy socialite, and she did have an interest in keeping her face in the public eye, and so she entered two very high-profile marriages, both of which were loveless marriages. In one marriage, she was actually acting as her husband's beard. In other words, her husband was a homosexual, and at the time, society frowned greatly upon homosexuality, and so this was more a marriage of convenience. For him, in the eyes of the public, he was a strong, healthy, leading man's man. She was the dutiful wife, the wealthy heiress. Wonderful power couple here. But that marriage ended with his death. Clarice explains that she did have a son, Douglas, who she felt no love for whatsoever. She was busy, focused on her own social graces. She was focused on keeping up her celebrity. So basically, she left it to nannies and boarding schools to raise her son. And she admitted that she gave her son the bare minimum in terms of financial support. Up until present day, she continued to give her son a meager stipend that was just enough that allowed him to have the basic necessities of life, but she really felt nothing towards her son. She didn't really feel any sense of responsibility towards him. And so Douglas now comes to be seen in a very sympathetic light. And Clarice again explains that even later in life she was trying to kill herself. Even a couple times she was in freak accidents and she found that she could not die. And so she realized that Jim had done something to her all those years ago. And putting two and two together with the post-crisis origin that Ostrander-Mandrake treated us to, it becomes clear that Jim used his power as a Spectre to create this spiritual bond between himself and Clarice. Well, Jim makes a step at an apology to Clarice, and he has to excuse himself from the room. And Clarissa comes back in, and here we learn that Clarissa is the one who is trying to murder her grandmother. She actually loves her father deeply, and her thinking is that by killing Clarice, her father will inherit the estate, and he will finally be able to enjoy a happy life. Well, of course, with Jim Corrigan being the Spectre, He is quite aware that Clarissa is now making a second attempt to kill Clarice, this time by smothering her with a pillow. So we see the Spectre enter the room. And because Clarissa has not committed an act of murder, the Spectre has to get creative in terms of how he's going to punish this. And what he does is he switches Clarissa and Clarice's souls. So Clarice's soul goes into the body of her much younger granddaughter, while Clarissa's soul is now trapped within the withering body of Clarice Winston. And the Spectre deems this to be a proper act of justice, and he tells Clarice that this is her second chance now to live a better life, to live a happy life, and he wishes her good luck, and he leaves. And of course, this story ends on such a note that you have to know that this is going to be followed up following the 0 Hour event. So, of course, 0 Hour happens in the summer of 1994, and in the beginning, the Spectre refuses to become involved in the event. When Wave Rider seeks out the Spectre's help in 0 Hour number 4, the Spectre appears quite angry and says that this is an entirely human matter and that it's beneath the affairs of the Spectre. And so it isn't until issue 1 of 0 Hour that Jay Garrick, who has now been returned to his proper chronological age, uses his remaining speed to track down the Spectre and rails against the Spectre and appeals to him to do something about it. And as Jay is erased from the timeline, the Spectre vows that he will have vengeance for Jay as well as all those other innocent souls who have been lost in the crisis. And so in 0 Hour number 0, we get the confrontation between the Spectre and Hal Jordan, who at this point has taken the name Parallax. He has absorbed all of the energy that was within the Green Lantern Corps Central Power Battery. He's also absorbed all of the residual chronal energy left over from the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, and he's now setting about his mad plan to create an entirely new reality, which is based on multiple parallel realities. In Hal's mind, he's giving everything that everybody wants. He's giving life back to some. He's giving the ability to walk back to some. Of course, this is a full decade before the Jeff Johns retcon for Parallax. So at this point, this is all of Hal's doing. It's all through his conscious will. And, I mean, it's just so fun reading the confrontation between the Spectre and Hal Jordan here, knowing what is going to transpire between the two only a few short years later in Day of Judgment. And something that really gets lost in issue 0 of 0 Hour is that the Spectre fails in his efforts to defeat Parallax. We see visually that Hal is quite capable of breaking the chains that the Spectre puts him in. But it's more than that. The Spectre is able to provide that last bit of energy that's needed to create the Big Bang and restart all of time. But the fact is, it's the alternate reality Batgirl along with Green Lantern Kyle Rayner and Green Arrow who take Hal Jordan down. And I think the fact that the Spectre fails to stop Hal on his own here, gets lost just because of all of the chaos that was going